Okay, sorry, it's been a little while since our last class on the stories of Rabba Bar Chana. I'm hoping to have one this evening and one tomorrow evening. Just to finish up on the second story, I wanted to share with you what Rebbe Nachman has to say about it. Rebbe Nachman explains that the Nechusei Yama, the people who came down or go down to the ocean, who are traveling in the seas, are those people who bring Torah into this world. And we said that they were telling Rebbe Nachman about the waves that are 300 amos. Now, this Rebbe Nachman's explanation is in Likutei Moharan Kama, Torah 13. And he'd explained earlier that on our tefillin, there are two shins. And keep in mind, the gematria of the letter shin is 300. And on our tefillin, shel rosh, on our head tefillin, there's a three-headed shin and a four-headed shin. And he explains that the three-headed shin represents the ability to gather people together. And the four-headed shin represents the ability to take people that you've gathered together and lift them up to come closer to Hashem. And that's why the story had mentioned that the waves traveled 300 parsos in a linear fashion, as well as being 300 parsos up. The 300 parsos that the wave traveled in a linear manner, that represents the ability for this tzaddik to gather many people together, and then to lift them all the way up 300 amos. One of the commentaries on Likutei Moharan points out that if you take a look at the names of the Shvatim, the names of the sons of Yaakov, the first three, who were all named by Leah, every single one of their names represents something about creating a connection. Ruvain is the fact that Yaakov would appreciate the fact that she had a child. Shimon is the fact that Hashem has listened to me. Levi is the fact that my husband will now accompany me. So in the same way, the three-headed shin represents the creating a connection with people, which of course is the step before lifting them up. Where were they lifted up to? So the story said they lifted up to a small star. Why a small star? Because a person can only succeed in creating a true spiritual connection if the person makes himself small. If the person makes himself big, there's no chance. And it said over there that the area in which the star was an area where you could plant 40 of mustard seed. And the reason for 40 is representing the 40 days for the Torah to be given, which parallel the 40 days of the gestation of a child. Because after being lifted up by the tzaddik who has the ability to uplift, that's the amount of time it takes for the person to actually develop a spiritual connection. But on the last part of the story, Rebbe Nachman really takes a very interesting twist, as Rebbe Nachman is wont to do. For those of you who are not familiar with Likutei Moharan, Rebbe Nachman makes a tremendous use of puns. I'm not sure that he or the Breslovers would appreciate my saying the word pun, but what I mean by that is that oftentimes when Chazal or even Psukim use a particular word, Rebbe Nachman will interpret it as a connection to a very similar word, even though that's clearly not what it means in context. But he puts a little bit twist and a spin about it on it. The Gemara had said that if we had been lifted higher, we would have been burnt by the star. And the word that means burnt is maklinan. And Rebbe Nachman wants to interpret the word maklinan, not meaning we would have been burnt, but rather things would have been easier for us. And Rebbe Nachman explains that one of the reasons often when you find someone who has left the path of Torah and you ask them, why did you leave? They'll tell you because there were certain things in Torah that made no sense to them and they couldn't understand them, and that's why they left. And because of their inability, and really all of us have this inability to one degree or another, to truly understand the depth of Hashem's plan, rather than chalking it up to their own lack of understanding, they reject Hashem and use it as a reason to abandon Hashem. And therefore, Rebbe Nachman explains that had this tzaddik succeeded in lifting everybody up to the highest point, they would have had a greater appreciation and understanding of Hashem, and they would not subsequently have fallen into this trap of abandoning Hashem because of their lack of understanding. And that's why it says, come, show me, are there any areas where you haven't lifted up people to those heights? Give me an opportunity to lift people up to those heights. And let's destroy that faulty reasoning for one and for all. But he responds that, I'm sorry, I'm not at that point where I can lift people up as high to such a level. Let's move on now to the third story. We're still in Maseches Bava Basra on page Ayin Gimel. Amud Aleph, the first side. Amar Rabba, Ledidi Chazili, I saw Hormin, or others say it's Hormiz Bar Lilis. Who is Hormiz Bar Lilis? So the Rashbam, in most of Bava Basra, there is no commentary of Rashi, and therefore the primary commentator on the Gemara is one of Rashi's grandsons, the Rashbam. The Rashbam says that Hormin Bar Lilis was a shade. Beto Gershom also says that. We'll discuss, probably not today, but in our tomorrow, hopefully, exactly what is the meaning of a shade. But he saw this shade, Hormin Bar Lilis, ki karohit, who was running akufya de shura de mechuza, on the top of the wall of the town of Mechuza. Virohit Parsha, and a cavalryman was chasing after this shade. Ki Rachiv, and the cavalryman was riding on a chevasa, on some sort of a beast. Others have the text of the Gemara reading a susya, on a horse, mitatoe beneath him. Velo yachile. So the simple explanation of the Gemara is that the cavalryman could not ride fast enough to catch up to the shade. Zimna chada, one time, havi me sarginle tarti kud naisi. He had saddled 2 mules, vikaimin, and he was standing Atre Gishri de Donag, on 2 bridges made out of wax. Some say it should say de Ronag, in a place called Ronag, but most of the explanations are based on the assumption that these bridges were made out of wax. Vishavar mehai lahai, and he was jumping from this bridge to that bridge, and mehai lahai, and from that bridge to this bridge. Vinukit trey mazgi dechamra biyadeh, and he was holding 2 cups of wine in his hands. Umorik, and pouring mehai lahai, he was pouring the wine from one cup to the other, umehai lahai, and then back. V'lo nutfa nitifusa la'ara, but none of the wine was falling onto the ground. He was doing such a good job of pouring the wine from cup to cup as he was riding on these 2 mules and jumping from one wax bridge to another, that none of the wine was dripping out onto the ground. Despite the fact that Oso Yom, that day was very stormy, Yalu Shemayim Yerdu Tahomos, that the seafarers on that day were being blown up to the heavens and then down into the depths, Hava, Adishamu Be Malchusa, until the king's household heard about this shade and what it was doing, V'katluhu, and they killed him. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will discuss, again, not today, a little bit about how to understand what is a shade. Quite clearly, as we mentioned when we started, anybody can tell that this is not a story which is meant to be understood in its pashut pshat, in its simple understanding. What is the meaning of it running along the top of the wall of Mechuzah? Who is this cavalryman who's chasing after him? What's this about riding the mules on wax bridges and pouring wine from one cup to another as he's doing that? And why in the world is the story ending with the king choosing to kill the shade? So we will start as usual with the explanation of the Gra of the Gaon of Vilna. And the Gra begins by quoting a pasuk that says, "V'hivdil haparoches bein hakodesh ubein kodesh hakadashim." That in the Mishkan and the tabernacle of the desert, there was a paroches, a tapestry, that created a division between the holy and the Holy of Holies. The Zohar explains that this is an allusion to the diaphragm, which separates our body inside. And the Zohar explains it separates between those parts of our body which give us the ability to speak. Those are the parts of our body which are more in touch with spiritual things, because speech is the power to study and to teach Torah. It's the power to daven. And on the other hand, the digestive system, which is Kodesh, but it's not Kodesh Kadashim. It's holy, but it's not the Holy of Holies. And he says that when it comes to Torah study, there's studying Torah as the Holy of Holies, and then there's some people who study Torah in order to show off their knowledge. And the Zohar says that people who study Torah for the purpose of showing off their knowledge, that they're from the Erev Rav. The Erev Rav were the Egyptian hangers-on to the Jewish people as they left Egypt and accompanied them out to the Midbar, to the desert. And they caused a tremendous amount of problems for Klal Yisrael when they're in the Midbar. When we see Rebbe Nachman's explanation on this Gemara, he elaborates on this idea of people who are studying Torah for ulterior motives. And therefore the Gra explains that Hormiz Bar Lilsa, this shade, was running on top of the wall of the city of Mechuzah. And the Gra quotes a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, which says that the most prominent people of Mechuzah, or really literally it says the most beautiful people in Mechuzah, had faces as black as the bottom of a pot. Why? Because they did everything beautifully. Every mitzvah they did was done in the most beautiful way possible. But they were black-faced. They were like a burnt pot because they did it all in order to show off. Walls, the Gra explains, is a metaphor for Torah scholars, true Torah scholars. Because the Gemara says in Bava Basra that true Torah scholars are not obligated to pay taxes for the protection of the city because their Torah study affords protection. So this shade, Hormuz, who represents those people who are studying Torah for all the wrong reasons, he was running on the wall of Mechuzah. He was running over the heads and stomping on all the Torah scholars of Mechuzah because he was trying to show off his Torah and to put down the true Torah scholars. The cavalryman was running down on the bottom, chasing after him. Why? Because the Torah scholars were trying to learn. They saw the diligence of those who were studying for ulterior motives and how much they were accomplishing, and they were trying to learn from that and to apply themselves as much as the people with ulterior motives, but they were unsuccessful. The drive to do something for ulterior motives is always going to outwin the intensity of someone who's doing something for the proper reasons. There's a well-known vart on Imlavan Garti that the pasuk says that when Yaakov met Esav, he said, "I lived with Lavan." And Rashi comments, "V'taryag mitzvos shamarti," that even though I lived with Lavan, I heeded the 613 mitzvos. V'lo lamadati mima'asav harayim, and I did not learn from his evil behavior. So simply that means I wasn't influenced negatively by Lavan. But others want to explain that Yaakov was lamenting. I lived with this wicked Lavan for 20 some odd years. And he was so always running after every opportunity to be a con man. And I tried my best to learn from him how to use the same enthusiasm for good, but I couldn't learn from him. I could not approach with enthusiasm for good his enthusiasm for evil. The Gemara went on and said that one time he would saddle 2 mules and was on these 2 bridges of wax. The 2 mules are a reference to the Yetzer Hara, because just like mules are unproductive, literally they cannot reproduce, so too the Yetzer Hara does not really produce anything lasting. And that's why they were on these bridges of wax, to represent the fact that when a person decides to invest himself in the Yetzer Hara, the results are not going to be long-lasting. And he was jumping from one to another. The Gra explains because a person is often flitting back and forth between his 2 Yetzer Haras, his 2 lusts, the lust for glory and the lust for physical pleasure. And nothing dripped down to the ground because he was so engrossed in his pursuit of these 2 pleasures of honor and physical pleasure that he didn't look down to the ground. It never dawned on him to check what he was doing and to see maybe he was doing something wrong. Even on the day of Yalu Shamayim Yerdu Tahomos, even on the day of death, when his soul is going to go up to the heaven and his body down to the depths, still the person doesn't stop to question the assumptions upon which he lives his life. Until finally, they hear in the heavenly kingdom how spiritually devoid and empty this person is. and he is spiritually killed, and he is dead. As I mentioned, B'li Neder, I hope that tomorrow night we will have the next class in this series. Thank you for listening.